Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Neap's webinar. You're obviously our early birds. We're starting right on time. And as teachers, I know you'll appreciate being on time and being prompt. I'm sure you've got a busy day ahead of you. So teaching is a pretty hard gig at the moment. I'm based in Melbourne and I'm locked down again, like many of you. And I sincerely thank you and applaud you for taking time to check in and to prioritise your learning, with yet again the focus being on how you can make things better for your students. As I conduct this webinar from home, I've kicked my family out with the dog. He's yet again on another walk, and hopefully my bandwidth and there's no interruptions, just as many of you have had to deal with over the last couple of weeks. With our current situation and the unpredictability in which we find ourselves, I've had to alter the content of this webinar to fit with the current climate, the energy levels and the realities of teaching and assessment at this particular time. Changes to our state formal assessment guidelines are live and fluid, and I'm not going to pretend to be across all of them. So to make this webinar a valuable resource and a good investment of your time when teachers are so incredibly time poor, I found this quote: "A good system shortens the road to the goal." And I think this is a great starting point to set the tone for this webinar. So before we begin, I encourage you to keep your camera on if you feel comfortable, whether you've got your hoodie on or your pajamas on, whatever floats your boat. Please just check that your microphone is turned off, because the background noise can become a little bit annoying, as we all know. And this webinar is being recorded. So if you need to head off somewhere, you can catch up at another time. And something else I also thought of was that Neap will also send PD certificates for this webinar at the conclusion. For today, we're using Slido for questions. So don't put them in the usual chat box with the Q&As. You visit that site and the code you put in is #Neap. And there'll be that little Q there on all my slides. So you don't need to take any notes. It'll appear in front of you. So I thought it was a pretty big call to use the word ultimate as the title of this webinar. However, when you see the objectives for today, they seem to cover a broad reach for teachers. And I hope to prompt some thought into an integral and unavoidable area of schooling that often overwhelms teachers and students, and that being exams. So today's objectives to reflect on the current exam procedures in your school and to refine, create and prompt change to deliver an improved process and ultimately to improve the experience from your senior students. Obviously, we also need to ensure academic integrity and the assessment security is upheld. And it would be good to also implement some processes and procedures that can ensure a smooth rollout, but ultimately to reduce the stress. So the obvious question becomes, why am I able to offer some insight into this for you? As you can see, I am an experienced teacher. I've taught within a range of different fields and recently just returned from teaching in Singapore at the Australian International School. I've taught across a range of different curriculum areas. My teaching methods are psychology and English. And as part of that journey, I've held various leadership roles, but the one that holds me in good stead to share some knowledge here is that I was Chief Invigilator at the AIS. And to give some background to that, at an international school, we held the IB exams and the Cambridge IGC exams, and we ran them concurrently. So they ran for a 6-week timetable period in the mid-year and then also at the end of year. So the exams range from 35 minutes to 2.5 hours in duration. And to give you some insight to these examinations, like the Cambridge IGCSE, they have 70 subjects in 30 different languages. And part of the Cambridge and the IB requirements is that they also have random inspectors that appear unannounced, and they scare the pants off you. And basically they go through all your policies and procedures to make sure that everything is with the code of conduct. And we passed with flying colours. So when operating at an international school, each country is also allocated particular time zones with specific regulations about how the exam must be conducted, so that obviously no one has an advantage. And during our planning, we needed to consider national holidays and religious festivals because of the number of countries and the student cohort. So consistently, our priority was to try to maintain an acceptable balance between the number of conflicts of the overall school scheduling, teaching time, assessment periods, marking, and the school reporting timeline. So it's this diverse teaching and leadership experience that's ultimately led me to my current role here at Neap, and I'm the Head of Digital Learning Innovation. I think it's probably appropriate we start with obviously the obvious, the ATAR. Currently each Australian state or territory, the ACACA is responsible for issuing the senior secondary certificate for that state or territory. So in my case in Melbourne, we have the VCE, HSE, etc. So Australian Year 12 graduates receive an ATAR score if they want to enter university. And as we know, the ATAR is a rank, it's not a mark. We know that universities use the ATAR to help select their students, and many universities are now obviously using some other criteria such as personal statements, portfolios, auditions, etc. And this is a promising movement as it reduces the stress levels of high-stake tests. We also know that there's vocational pathways and VCAL and alternative pathways our senior students can choose. However, regardless of the student's pathway, examinations are an escapable component to student life. And I think if we look at this, just to give a bit of an overview, we've got a Gonski survey in 2019, 1,400 respondents, and it gives us a bit of an overview of what Australians actually think of ATAR. So 48% think it's unfair, 80% think that we should consider other things other than just a score, and 67% believe that it creates unnecessary stress on students. I've also got this other screenshot here, which again offers a different perspective, and no doubt we share these with our students. So Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba. So lots of failures, however, highly successful. So I show these two images here, I suppose, as discussion points about, so how effective and appropriate is ATAR ranking? And is ATAR viable, correct, or fair? And what do exams actually assess? Are they correct parameters or measures of knowledge and skills? So all of these questions are something that I'm passionate about discussing, but they're for another day. So if we get down to it, so I've taken an example here, physics. And if we look at the weighting of exams across the different certificates in Australia at the moment, we've got physics is actually in drafting process for a new study design in 2022. And currently this draft proposes that the end of year exam is worth 50% of the student's mark. In HSE at the moment, the trial exams, which obviously have been held up at the moment, and there's lots going on with that, but on average, that makes up about 30% of the school assessed mark. And then they have the end of year exam worth 50% of their score. If we also look at the IB, physics has also increased in the weighting of exams from 2020 to 2021. It was at 60% and they've moved it now to be worth 80%. So with the example of physics, the trend is also evident in maths and other science subjects, that the weighting of exam performance still remains substantial. And until this changes, implementing an organised, effective and fair program in your school is really important. Academic integrity focuses on equipping our learners with capabilities and values necessary to conduct ethical scholarship. And when we think about learning for life, this becomes really important. So most schools will already have an academic integrity and plagiarism policy. And in most schools, students are introduced to these concepts in Year 7, and it continues throughout their schooling and obviously increases in detail as academia progresses. By the time a student's in their senior years, they should be well schooled in this area and the expectations should be clear. I'd also recommend that this policy be visible to students as a reminder of their conduct, not something that just appears around exam time. And this includes summary copies of the policy around in classrooms, just dot points that it's there, it's a reminder. Assessment security focuses on hardening assessment against attempts to cheat. and on detecting any cheating that has occurred. And with technological advancements, just looking for passing cheat notes doesn't cut it anymore. At this stage, our Year 12 examinations are paper-based. Like most things, the global pandemic has pushed us towards faster technological uptake, and online exams are an example of this. And considerations like gathering in a crowd, indoor spaces, the potential travel risk coming to and from the examination venues are all important variables. In places like the UK, the Cambridge IGCSE, they moved their online final exams due to the pandemic. Australian universities have also used online exams, the Australian National University and University of New South Wales, to name a few. So when exams are conducted online, there's surveillance-like software that's used where students are asked to show ID. They screen grab a picture of their computer settings, and there's software that actually monitors their eye movements when completing the test. So when they're conducted this way, there's parity factors such as internet connections and the environment, the space that a student takes the test. It's not always a conducive academic testing space. I've read some quotes from students who've taken online exams and comments like, it's not fun knowing that you're being watched and recorded every breath and every movement, which is fair call. And it's also, some kids have also commented that it's even more invasive than a normal exam. So the possibility of our Year 11 and 12 exams moving online is, in my opinion, a little way off for some of our administrators. They're still reviewing our national curriculum framework at this stage. And while each state has a different assessment system, this also poses some difficulty. I think that the shift is inevitable, and one that I think will create a much more streamlined process. But ultimately, the goal of any secondary school exam program is to provide an environment that facilitates students to perform their personal best under the guidelines and the restrictions of the governing system. So currently in Australia, some schools will conduct exams from Year 9. Most schools conduct trial exam programs in Year 11, and these exams are internally marked and the school sets their own policy. In Year 12, the exams are externally marked and they must abide by external restrictions and policies across the states. In my opinion, replicating an authentic examination experience, regardless of it being a trial or external exam, is important. So the adage, practice makes perfect, rings true for this. We know as adults that exams and tests are just a part of life. And if students experience exam protocol from the beginning, it's proven to reduce their anxiety by the time they get to higher stakes. In my experience, replicating exam procedures and expectations in trial, and I even go as far as to do that in my class tests, and it should occur for this reason. So although that it can be confronting and nerve-wracking at the start for some students, these are trials or class tests. They can learn, they can experience, and it's in a safe place. And that's part of our job as teachers, to teach and to prepare students for academic performance, to coach them and to perform them to their personal best. Excuse me. I'll ask the question. So who owns the portfolio of exams in your schools? So is it the Director of Teaching and Learning, the head of senior school, head of department, perhaps it's head of operations? So exams are often fraught with a lack of ownership. Perhaps this is because it requires intense organisation. You have to operate at a highly regulated process. It's detailed documentation. There's high risk to student performance, high risk to school performance, and obviously there's tangible, visible outcomes. So managing your school's exam program involves working collectively with many roles. So your heads of department, your heads of year, school services, wellbeing team. It's a team production and it involves really clear communication and leadership. And in my opinion, these are the things that make up components to a successful school examination program. And you can't go past this one, a united leadership team, it's critical. So, and I think that comes down to so many people being involved. The policies are across domains and therefore all leaders need to be united with one message. And this is one area within a school that there needs to be consistency. no loopholes and no exceptions. And I think that's often the problem, that this is not how school life rolls. We know that every day there's exceptions to the rule, and that's what makes this job difficult. The buy-in of all staff. Staff need to proactively support your school exam program. They lose rooms, there's timetable changes, following guidelines and adhering to due dates. It can't just be the Year 12 coordinator. When we talk about the buy-in of all staff, it's from Year 7 up. And obviously the level of detail varies. However, the processes and the expectations are across the secondary school. Exams are not something that just happen in Year 12. Testing occurs throughout our learning journey, and it doesn't need to be scary or overcomplicated or stressful. And this is what probably leads me to the next point, the school culture of exams. So we know that some schools philosophically disagree with exams and the ATAR. And on the other hand, some schools market and brand their student achievements purely on exam results. So perhaps these schools are presented with a clash of priorities when it comes to exams. No matter where your school sits on these ideals, if your school uses exams as part of your assessment, I'm sure your goal is to provide the best environment for your students to perform. So when I'm referring to culture, some important questions that I encourage you to have with your leaders. So what language does your school use? Do you use words like personal best or high scores or ATAR focused, just a part of life, pathway, or the end of the line, which I'm sure no one does, but you get what I mean. It's the language that your school uses. What are the parent perceptions and expectations of exams? And these have really important ramifications for the students' preparation, their home study practices. So these need to be aligned, or if they're not aligned, at least the parents need to be aware of the expectations that your school has. Having taught and lived in Asia for many years, Asian examination culture is totally different to Australia's. Singapore's school system is structured very differently to ours, and high-stake tests and exams are common, and they occur from a really early age, from grade 5. And these results of the exams have a huge impact to a student's educational pathway. And these cultural influences need to be considered when you're looking at your school exam program. And another important question to sort of unpick that further is ask your students how they perceive exams at your school. So do they perceive them as stressful? Do they feel motivated? Do they feel defeated? Or perhaps, and hopefully, they feel empowered. So the culture of exams is an important conversation so that your school culture is aligned with your values and your parent community. The investment of time and resources, it can't just be an addition to someone's role, as it so often is. At the end of the day, schools are for academic purposes and staff need to be supported. So given time to plan and prepare and lead. And not all schools are able to invest in examination spaces, but they need to prioritise the relevant times of years that the exams occur. It can be a logistical nightmare. However, an acceptance with this buy-in attitude from all staff supports this positive school culture. And last but by no means least is clear documentation of the processes and the school policies. And they need to be distributed to obviously the staff, but the students, and in some cases also the relevant documents to the parents as well. I really love this quote here. So knowing what to do when you don't know what to do for students and teachers, automaticity. And exams can be stressful for both staff and students. And if things become automatic in terms of the processes and the expectations, that anxiety and that stress can be reduced. I strongly recommend obviously reaching out to the particular assessment guidelines. It's a moving target at the moment in terms of New South Wales, your trial examinations. Victoria, we don't know what's going on up further down the line. So when we reach out to our curriculum boards, don't feel afraid to call them and to ask questions. That's what they're there for. And I think the best place to start is with a blueprint, a workflow of the exam program. And here is just a brief example of where to start. And this part here is where you obviously start from your school reporting timeline. Defining responsibilities creates the supported culture. And obviously we have stages in terms of preparation of the exam paper, preparation for students, and the preparation for the chief invigilator, or that person who takes that responsibility on. I highly recommend when you do these blueprints, you include dates, because dates make people accountable, and it also keeps the process moving. The other tip I would also give is work backwards, and that's where we start from here, and the other sort of angles in the school work from that point. And this obviously leads me to the invigilators, the supervisors, and the support staff of your exam program, and they're integral to the success of how your program rolls out. So what are the regulations or the ratios? And they're predetermined by your state certificate guidelines. When you're obviously working out your supervision, you'll also need to consider students who have special provisions, as they will require extra staffing. So what makes a good invigilator? Some would joke that a pair of noisy high heels to clonk down the hallway to scare students. However, something more along the lines of having passion and compassion. Exams are a stressful part for some students, and they need to be compassionate and set the tone of the room. I think a good invigilator sets this tone, and they make students feel confident and assured that they can and they will do well. What tasks do they perform? Well, they set the room up, they check the exam papers, they lay them out before the students arrive, they check the requirements and the materials, the instructions of the exam, they start the exam, they explain the restrictions. And what are they responsible for? Well, ultimately, they ensure that all students have an equal opportunity to demonstrate their best abilities. They have to ensure that the security of the examination before, during, and after, prevent possible malpractice, prevent possible administrative failures. And one point here is often this staffing group is quite fluid. Often in schools, it's people's extras. However, consistency is the key. If you can have a core group of staff that do this with you, I think it benefits you as a school in terms of the processes and the organisation easy adhered to, but also in the case of special provision students that need extra time or guidelines and breaks, when they can have that relationship with one, maybe two, if you need to, consistent staff members, it will benefit their performance. It's important when you're looking at the staffing of your exam program to consider potential bias of relationships. So in the case of VCE, the VCAA states that a VCE invigilator for the external exams cannot be related or associated with any student undertaking a VCE 3-4. So often these staff members are parents and members of the community, and these questions need to be asked just to make sure there is no biases there. They also cannot be a teacher or a tutor of Unit 3-4 VCE subject, and they cannot be any school personnel engaged in organising or checking the VCE external assessments. The school is responsible for training all of your invigilators, and they need to make sure that obviously they understand what's expected of them, they know the regulations for conducting the exams, and that they feel confident and supported so they can do the job effectively. The other point to VCAA, they require all newly appointed chief supervisors to complete a training course from their VCAA website, and they need to do it before they start their role. So all of these things need to be considered when staffing your exam program, which often sort of get left till last, but they are really critical. I think the other point down here, schools should also consider their succession and emergency plans. There's lots of IP with this role, and all of the information, if it's just left in one person's hands, you're left open to a pretty stressful time. Even such things as, you know, if one person has the key to the secure exam location and they get stuck in traffic. So there does need to be plan B operating, because this is one area of schooling that it needs to run on time. I've mentioned it a couple of times, but I'm quite passionate about this, and I think it's really important. It's important to create exam integrity and parity for all students. And when we look at students with special provisions, this can become a really big job and a really specialised job. And when we talk about a range of staff members contributing, this is where it becomes really important. So any student that is eligible for special provisions, approval must be sought early. And there needs to be lots and lots of evidence and reports, and that's key. So often the student welfare coordinator, they play a really pivotal role in this. EAL students can also receive special provisions for some exams in some circumstances. And special provisions can include time extensions, extra breaks, coloured paper, bigger print, or someone acting as a scribe or a reader, an interpreter in some case, and uses of technology. These can all make a really big difference to some of our students. A confidential list that summarises these provisions is provided, and it needs to be constantly referred to by the exam coordinator to make sure that for every exam where appropriate, they are receiving these provisions. And I would also recommend that a perhaps summarised version of that list be distributed to the staff who are supervising these students, as often, students with diabetes or epilepsy or a psychological disorder, exams that anxiety can trigger the students, and for everybody's best benefit, they need to be aware of what those details are, obviously depending on privacy. I think as well, obviously, this is where the invigilator's role becomes important, not only to ensure that the students are getting the best chance to perform their best, but also that integrity of the exam program is upheld. So it's the school's responsibility to train the invigilators on what these provisions are. And so for an example, if a student is allocated a reader for exams, the invigilator needs to know that a reader cannot read the student's answers back to them. They also need to know that the reader can't operate a calculator at the student's direction. And nor can they advise the student in any way by prompting or discussing the answers. Key resources for exam procedures and policies, pretty bland stuff really, but obviously depending on your state, the VCAA or NISA, but I also, if you haven't gone down this line before, the Cambridge Assessment, International Education and the IB, they're big organisations and they have numerous free resources available to teachers online. And this includes training materials and signage and checklists. So rather than just reinventing the wheel, it is available there, it's free and it's accessible for teachers. Anomalies, trials versus external. So this is where this cross support and the clear communication between various departments and roles within a school become important. So we can't plan for everything, but these are some of the anomalies that you can plan for. A lot of these policies probably exist in your school. However, I encourage you to review them as part of your exam prep. Obviously, with our current climate, there are special COVID committees that have been set up to deal with our ever-changing climate, and it would be ill-informed of me to proclaim to be across all of them. But again, call them, ask them, it's their job, and I'd highly recommend that you don't guess. These responsibilities are fairly, you'd hate to be the person that instructed students incorrectly for the sake of their performance and for your school. So I would really pester them, especially when, it's a moving target at the moment. At a practical level, anomalies can mostly be accounted for with reasonable confidence. The toilet break one here, that used to drive me crazy. We ended up having a policy that any exam under 45 minutes, no toilet break was allowed. Any time after that, the student had to raise their hand, place their paper under the table face down and be escorted to the bathroom with only one at a time. And this obviously had repercussions for supervision ratios, but Sometimes it's nervousness that they want to get out of the room or stretch their legs or behavioral episodes. But there's a lot of things that can go amiss while they're in the bathroom. So it's nice to sort of set the tone that you're here for the exam and you sit and you do it. And obviously personal judgment comes in when kids can leave the room. Something also to draw your attention to perhaps is your late policy. And this is where that point about whether it being a trial or a formal external exam, I believe the rules should be the same and the procedure of which you take the exam should follow through. So if I look at the VCE for an example, the VCAA rules that if a student is 30 minutes late for a written exam, they'll be admitted to the exam room and the student is allowed the full writing time, but is given no allowance for any missed reading time. However, if the student arrives after 30 minutes from the scheduled start time, they can be admitted only if the following guidelines are met. So this is, they state that the principal or the principal's delegate, and this is what your school needs to have as part of your exam protocol. We know that principals have busy lives and they're not always on campus at our mobile phone beck and call. So you need to have a principal's delegate. And in this case, who is the delegate? And what they must do is they need to recommend that the student can be admitted to the exam. When the student is admitted to the exam, they must enter and sign a declaration that you make that they understand that they are accepted into the room, but the VCAA may not accept their paper. The student is advised of this condition and they need to sign it with a date and a time. And then once the exam is concluded, a stat DAC needs to be signed off by the supervising teacher, the principal's delegate, with time that they entered and that they were late and all those details being recorded. And the student needs to sign that. And these conditions can be different for performance and language oral exams. And I think these conditions obviously highlight the importance of your invigilators being trained, but also noting and recording things as you go. Even if something, it doesn't amount to anything, it just limits that that awkward situation that the student or yourself may be placed in. Whoops. Here we are. And I think that point at the bottom there, the VCA must receive an irregularity application no later than 7 days after the assessment. And I think as experienced teachers, these anomalies can cause a lot of drama, and the best way to put a stop to it is just to have that signed and dated and done, and then follow it through later when people are a bit calmer, and it can just be followed through. The other point there is the VCA also states when we're looking at early dismissals. So students will not be permitted to leave the VCE external examination before 30 minutes have elapsed from writing time. It also states that students will not be permitted to leave in the last 5 minutes of the external assessment time. So these are processes that, regardless of it being trial or the formal external, just keep the rules the same. Then the students don't get confused and the staff don't get confused.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to everyone. Just want to know.
There we are. Thank you. All right. So we've got some good practice tips here, and I think it comes down to this. So all students sitting the exam should receive the same experience. That's what we need to provide. Therefore, it's really important that there's consistency in the exam room setup, and this will reduce the number of issues that you have to deal with during the live exams. So things such as like the chairs being 1.5 meters apart, the clock, a timer, the exam papers laid out in a particular way, student ID, is it at the top of the table, visible so everyone can see? There shouldn't be any helpful material on the walls. How many times have you set a class test, and then when you finish the test you realize you've got the poster of the book that you just asked them to do the test on? So all the examination rooms need to be consistently set up the same way. Good signage around the school to eliminate disruptions. So many times staff will just barge into a library because they don't know there's exams on, and we've all done it. But if there's signage around the school, those disruptions can be kept to a minimum. Approved materials to be used in the exam room. So follow the formal exam regulations, and they can be different, obviously, for each subject. But this is, again, when you're doing a trial examination, have the same rules go on. When you do your class tests, have the same equipment that they can bring in as they would as they move forward to their year 11 and 12 exams. Things like dictionaries and calculators. Calculators in particular for math subjects, they can have scientific calculators in some exams. In other exams, they're just allowed the normal the normal regular calculators. So those sort of things need to be checked, obviously, before they start the exam. And I actually recommend before the students come into the room, all of this equipment is checked outside the room. So get them to line up in their student numbers or roll call or their seat allocation, and then obviously make sure that their equipment is right to reduce all that checking inside the room. And I think that comes to the point that the exam room needs to be its own environment. So make it a calm, synchronized place. Set the tone and eliminate the disruptions and the unpredictability. The exam conditions need to be reflected in the transcript that the invigilators read out to the students. So all of the instructions on how to go about completing the exam, different things to draw the students' attention to, cover pages, page numbers, extra inserts, reading pages, all of those important details need to be read out clearly in the transcript. And I think that when I said at the beginning, I'm going to give you lots of tips and make this worth your time. So Neap have got their free exam checklist and a transcript as well, which is free to download from their website. So again, rather than reinventing the wheel, there's resources here that you're free to use. Obviously, they leave gaps for things like subject appropriateness and stuff like that, but it's been checked, it's original, and you're welcome to use it. The other free resource I wanted to share with you was the Google free stopwatch, and it's obviously over on that website here. And I used to use this a lot, and especially when you get to the serious side of things, when there's perhaps a number of examinations running in the same room, it's hard to keep track of times, you know, reading time and completion times and things like that. It will set up a counter. Most rooms at this stage will have a projector. You can shine it up there. All the kids, you know, none of this crossing off on the whiteboard 5-minute intervals. The clock will count down for you, and you don't need to keep track of it yourself. You can also add details on that screenshot that you can set up with things like the reading time and those sorts of details that might be relevant to your subjects. It's a bit of a downer, but unfortunately, the reality of exams is malpractice and cheating. And I would encourage you to talk to your students about the dangers of cheating. And times have changed from when perhaps you sat your senior exams. It certainly has from when I did. With the rapid technology innovations, there's many, many ways that students can access information. There's Bluetooth technology, the watches they use, there's very, very small phones, there's all sorts of things. When I did a Google search on ways to cheat, I was a bit gobsmacked, to be honest. This one here got me. So Bluetooth ear things that you can obviously have someone at home reading to you the answers or the formulas or whatever it is. So it is something that has changed a lot. It's unfortunately something that's important when we talk about exams. And perhaps I see it as something that, you know, if a student wants or needs to cheat, they will find a way. And this is where students, supervisors need to be vigilant and demonstrate focused attention during the exam. And that's not marking papers or on your phone or reading a book. It's actually being physically present in the room and watching the students, not like a hawk, again, encouraging them and making them feel confident, but you need to be much more aware of all the sort of strategies that kids can come up with. I think there's two important points around malpractice that number one, students need to be given the opportunity to hand over anything suspicious before they enter the exam room. So perhaps in nervousness, they've got a cheat sheet in their pocket or whatever the case may be. And that comes back to my point about before they come in the room, you check their calculators, make sure they have pencils and pens, all those things. Everyone's had a kid turn up to the exam and they say, I don't have a pen. You know, there's a lot of nervousness that happens. So give them the chance before they enter the room. Give them a second chance when you read it in the transcript as they're sitting down, and perhaps they just want to hand it in without any repercussions. Don't make a big deal out of it, just take it away and it's done. And I think the second point I need to make is obviously that the invigilators need to be aware that anything they suspect as malpractice needs to be reported at the time of the incident. And that's where it gets down to the students need to sign and the staff need to sign with date and times and reporting it in detail at the time of the occurrence. And that stops it from becoming blown out of proportion or inaccuracies moving forward. I think it would be remiss of me not to mention Neap's products. I mentioned that my role is the Head of Digital Learning Innovation. And obviously part of Neap, they've been around for 30 years. They're going through a bit of a transformation with their business at the moment, but they have a large publishing content side of their business, which most of you probably would have used. They have their trial paper-based exams, and that just gives you a bit of an idea of, obviously, Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland is developing. Most people are familiar with the maths and the science, but there are subjects there that perhaps you're not familiar with that are fairly new to their product range. And I think as well, something else that Neap have developed is their digital tests for VCE, HSC, and again, it's developing for Queensland. And this is where the tests are auto-marked and they're collated into detailed assessment reports for teachers. So that's been going quite popular, obviously, with New South Wales and Victoria being in lockdown. So it's nice to be able to assign a digital test for the students to complete. I'd like to now, I'll move to Slido, where the questions, hopefully there'll be something there waiting for me. I'd like to thank everyone for listening, and I hope it's been a valuable experience that prompts you to evaluate and hopefully to enhance your school's exam program. And being conscious of time, you're probably all about to jump on your calls for your students. So if some people need to head off, I wish you all the very best. And kindness as well. We all need to be kind to each other at the moment. So if you need to head off, that's fine. Otherwise, I'm going to head to Slido and see if there's anything there I can help, or let's just, where would that? And see what's waiting here. Where are we? Yeah. Excellent. So will these slides be available? Yes, the slides will be available and the webinar will be recorded. So at this stage, I think there will be an email that goes out for all the registered viewers where you receive a PD certificate, and you'll also receive the link for the slides. Perhaps you can show it to your team and you can talk through some of the things that hopefully I've prompted a little bit of thought around. And thank you for your thanks, but I'm super conscious of what hard gig teaching is at the moment. So thank you for attending, and I really do wish you well. And please, if there's any further comments or anything, my details, I'll go back to it. My details are, here we are. And I welcome you to contact me if you would like to share anything, even some of the resources that you found really helpful. Yeah, I wish you well, good luck, have a great day. I hope you don't get zoomed out, and all the best.